and it's like, oh, she's gorgy. I would love to suck her blood. Welcome to Groovy Movies. My name is Lily Austin.
And my name's James Brailsford. Hello.
Hello. And this week, we've got a double bill for you. We have, we are discussing two movies, Robert Eggers' 2024 Nosferatu, and the film it was based on, the original 1922 version directed by F.W. Murnau.
Yes, a classic of like German expressionist cinema, which, as a young film student, that comes on your radar very quickly. That and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Well, I was lucky enough to see Nosferatu, I believe it was 2 years ago on the 100th year anniversary of the film at the Prince Charles.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they did a screening with a live accompaniment by a violinist and pianist, Hugo Max, which was fantastic. Went with the other James in my life, and it was brilliant. And then I rewatched it last week in preparation for this discussion and was a bit unsettled by the fact that the score was very different in this version that I watched, because actually something I didn't realize was, for reasons that we'll get onto, most of the score doesn't exist anymore. And so every time the film is released, I mean, there are lots of versions online or you go to see it at the cinema, there is an interpretation of the score rather than the original score.
Yeah, because some silent movies had a specific score composed for them. A lot of them didn't. It was like improvised by whoever in the Fleef pit was playing the piano that week. But with this, I didn't realise until kind of doing a bit of research that it did have a score. But yeah, I saw mine at a screen about 5 years ago, I think. It was actually in some kind of underground maintenance station for underneath the Thames. So you basically went underground, and it was like around Halloween time, so it was all very spooky. There were about 200 of us packed into this like underground. It felt like a warehouse, and yeah, we had a pianist and a percussionist playing along. Yeah, it was great. The atmosphere was cool.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend, if you're going to watch this film, I think you can find it online. I will add a link to the show notes, but I would recommend not watching it that way and seeing it in a cinema if you can find a re-release. Periodically, you'll find it at cinemas like the Prince Charles. But the thing, so much that I learned this week doing this research, I didn't realise that Nosferatu is an illicit version of...
Oh, a knockoff.
A knockoff, yeah, of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah. It's mad, isn't it? And it's almost beat for beat. It's just the same with all the names have been changed for copyright reasons, or they didn't stop Bram Stoker's widow from still suing.
Yeah. So that's the thing. So the film was made in 1922 by a German production company called Prana Films, and this production company was put together basically to make this film with this idea that this was going to be the first in many gothic horror movies.
Occult-themed films.
Yeah, it's such a shame because I'm so fascinated by this by this production company. Apparently, one of the two members was an occultist. Like, they were obsessed with the occult and all things kind of mystical and a little bit spooky.
It was interesting as well to kind of do the research again to realise, like, okay, so what is there any difference? And the one tangible difference is the fact that in Nosferatu, daylight will kill him, whereas in Dracula, which people forget in the original source material, it doesn't kill him, it just reduces his powers. He can't transform, for example, during the daytime, so he's still able to exist, and it's not deadly to him, it just kind of drains him of most of his powers. And that I had no idea. So now, of course, when we popularly think of, in the pop culture, when we think of vampires, that's one of their traits, isn't it, that sunlight is deadly to them, whereas that's actually not from the source material of Dracula, it's Nosferatu. It's a little bit like how how all of Superman's characteristics and traits, they weren't created in the comic book. In the comic book, he could only leap buildings in a single bound. He couldn't fly. But in the still frames of a comic, him leaping over a building looks like a man in mid-flight. So when they tried to do that for the film adaptation, when it was like a mini-series back in the 40s, it looked ridiculous having a man jumping. So they're like, let's make him fly instead. So then the comics were like, oh, you know what? Flying looks cool, so we'll take that. And then the radio show, the faster than a speeding bullet, is it a bird, is it a plane, no, it's Superman. That was the introduction to the radio play. So the point is, these different mediums kind of created the popular culture view of what Superman is. A little bit like here, where we've got two different versions that they've smushed together in our heads, and that's now the definitive, when actually one's a rip-off of the other. They've both got slight different elements to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Unless we forget Father Christmas. He never used to wear a red suit before Coca-Cola branded him that way.
Are we sure that's for real? Is that definitely for real, that one? Because that sometimes I'm like, are you sure?
I don't.
Is that not conspiracy from Coca-Cola?
I don't. That's a good point. I don't know, James. I do not have the capacity to fact check this. I'm too in Nosferatu land right now. But if any of our listeners want to write in and clarify, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, please leave a comment. Yeah.
So Nosferatu was just a completely illegitimate rip-off because the novel was very much still in copyright, and so the film came out, was a huge critical hit, and was on course to be a commercial success. But of course, Bram Stoker's widow got wind of this illegal adaptation and sued Prana Films. And so they completely, understandably, because as we said, basically nothing has changed, just names, but the story is exactly the same as the novel. So she won the lawsuit, and Prana was basically bankrupted. And part of the agreement of the lawsuit was to destroy all copies of the film. Thankfully, a few were saved, and that is why we still have it to this day. But that's part of the reason why we don't have the score anymore. Like, so much of the material is gone, which just seems like insanely devastating. Like, it's sort of kind of is akin to the fact that like lots of old films in that time, once they'd been made and released, were destroyed. There wasn't the sense that we should be preserving this. This is part of film history. When this film, is regularly referenced as one of the films that was like essential in defining the horror genre. It set the terms, the parameters for what horror would become.
Yeah, I mean, all the very stylized sets and the quite shadowy lighting, that was a hallmark of German Expressionism, which Murnau also directed The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a very similar looking, very similar kind of style film as well. Because you're quite right. It's remarkable that around this period, film history didn't really exist in 1922 because the movies had only really been invented in 1895. Feature film lengths were kind of only just coming in around that time, I think, or the longer feature. So, but they were just seen as disposable entertainment. You made your money by releasing it once, and then there was TVs didn't exist. TVs were like another 20 years before being invented. So there was no way to reuse the material now. So yeah, they weren't really seen as these kind of things that should be preserved for future generations.
But yeah, it's really hard to kind of express just how important these early films were, though, because as you said, in these very early days of cinema, these films were what were creating film language. Now when we watch a movie, we all can read a film, we all speak film, but this language had not yet been defined. And so it's an interesting thing when we look at these two films, this recent remake and the 1922 version, because I wouldn't say that the 2024 film is like a super terrifying, scary movie, but it does elicit some creepiness, some dread. It's got those classic hallmarks.
It's got a nightmarish. It's a gothic horror, isn't it? Rather than an out and out terrifying horror, it's like an atmospheric gothic horror. My feeling was. Yeah,
absolutely. But it does give you this like creeping sense. I think it pushes the right sort of buttons. Whereas you go back to the 1922 version, and realistically, it's not scary for a viewer watching it now. It's not a scary film, and it's kind of amusing in some places. But it was terrifying at the time. And it was, like you said, the coming up with the shadowy lighting, the way Nosferatu looks, the creepiness around him and his physicality, all of that was so crucial in like creating what now today is considered much more scary than that. So it's like it's a super important film, even if I'm going to be honest. It's like a very interesting movie to watch, but I find it does lag to me a little bit. You know, it doesn't have quite it doesn't have the pacing that we're so used to now, because of course films in those days were sort of shot almost like theatre productions. You know, so that like the camera movement isn't quite there, but it's
the technology is very crude. You know, there's no sound. It's like you can't really judge them by modern standards, but they're more to be appreciated than you can't really be like the audience were back in the time. You've got to remember only like 20 odd years earlier, people were freaking out because they were seeing themselves on the screen. I mean, the cliches that the train arriving at the station made people run away in fear. Although I've heard that actually that was the 1940 remake they did in 3D rather than the original. Anyway, so that's where that urban myth came from. But the point is, we our tastes are more refined. We're way more cine literate. So it might not scare you the same, which is why this remake is interesting, because I think for a modern audience, it's probably giving you a sense of the dread and the kind of the unease you would have felt if you were watching the original in 22.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of say that just because I've seen a few articles talking about how the new Nosferatu isn't as good as the original. And I just find it impossible to compare these two films. They're in completely different worlds. They are doing, even though the story is essentially the same, it is really impossible to, and I think a little bit pretentious to say that, to be honest, because you just can't compare these two films made in such different times, in such different contexts.
I think the one thing that is fair to say is that certainly I don't think this Nosferatu will have any kind of the same impact that the original had on cinema, just because of where it was placed in history. So that's the one thing you can absolutely say that the original Nosferatu has. But which one would I rather rewatch right now? The 2024 remake.
Okay, that's good to hear, because we need to discuss your viewing of this movie. And I will say, like, absolutely, you're so right. It not only is hugely influential to film history, but also to Bram Stoker's Dracula itself, the novel, because despite the fact that his widow sued about this film, that book was not a big hit. It hadn't done particularly well after it was published in 1897. It was this adaptation, it was Nosferatu, that made the book popular and popularized it and kind of solidified Dracula as the concept of the vampire that we all know to this day. Right. It solidified it in the kind of the cultural mind.
I didn't realise that. Yeah, I assumed that it was a knockoff film because they couldn't afford the rights because the book was such a popular hit back in the early 1900s. No,
it was the opposite. Because it hadn't done it had like a modest success, but they basically, I think, thought, we're a German film company. That's an Irish author. No one's ever going to see this movie. We'll get away with it. We don't need to bother getting the rights. We're a small startup film production company. Let's not bother.
A cultist film production company.
Exactly. So it's actually Bram Stoker has a lot to thank Nosferatu for, despite their like fraudulent ways.
Well, again, it's like they're interacting with each other. They're in dialogue with each other, as I think you would say about these kind of things, aren't they? And even this the remake is like in dialogue with the original version in 1922, because there's references, there's kind of like things that are adapted and recreated to some degree.
Yeah. So should we talk about it? Let's talk about the differences, because actually much is the same. It is very much like a straight reboot, I would say. There's only a few kind of crucial things that are different, but the skeleton of the story is very much the same. A creepy man, a creepy estate agent sends his employee to visit Count Orlok, aka Dracula.
Nosferatu, don't get the lawyers on us. He's Nosferatu, not Dracula.
Yeah,
reasons.
I'm saying Count Orlok. That's what he's called in the book. Count Orlok. In the film version, Count Orlok, i.e., aka Dracula.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, because aka is Nosferatu in the film, because they're like, he's not really Orlok, he's Nosferatu. Anyway.
Yeah, sorry. Oh my God, too many different words.
Which they don't do in Dracula. In Dracula, he's Dracula, right? He doesn't have a pseudonym, and then he's like, ha, really, I'm Dracula.
Well, I don't think he's really like Nosferatu allegedly is the Romanian word for a vampire. So in the novel, this word comes up at some stage, but apparently there's like questions about the etymology of this word and whether or not that's actually accurate. But anyway, so I feel like it's not like Nosferatu. I feel like Dracula and Orlok are the two. Dracula is changed to Orlok, and in both Nosferatu is like when I'm looking in the text, it's a vampire. I feel like Nosferatu is the placeholder for vampire because it sounds a bit more dramatic. I mean, I have to say, I feel like Nosferatu is a way more creepy title for a film than Dracula. So that was a good shout on their part.
Yeah.
So anyway, we follow Thomas Hutter as he goes to visit Count Orlok, and this is a man who's newlywed to a woman called Ellen, and when he meets Count Orlok, the main difference we find is that in the 1922 version, the story is basically that Count Orlok encounters this estate agent, and he is there very much to do his job, to sign off the papers so that the Count can move into a house in the German town where Thomas Hutter lives. And then he sees this picture of Ellen, his wife, and is like, oh, she's gorgy. I would love to suck her blood. The big difference in the 2024 version is that it's all premeditated, the sucking Ellen Hutter's blood. This isn't something because he sees the picture. She called him in her youth, called him to her, and was then kind of followed by him, kind of haunted by him for years after. And now he has discovered that she is married and is very jealous, wants to get back over there and, I guess, get back with her.
Yeah, and watching it at the remake, I couldn't remember if that was how the plot went in the original. So I think it's much better. It makes it much more interesting. I think it plays into the kind of the gothic creepiness and also this feeling of dread that everything's already been preordained. That this is already like it's almost like the fates are set before the film even started. You know, and there's references throughout to Ellen's character having had mental health issues when she was younger. So, you know, it all ties together. You know, she's all in, I think the kind of Von Helsing character played by Willem Dafoe says that in another time she would have been like a high priestess, that she's got some kind of spiritual, cosmic connection to the other world that unfortunately drags Nosferatu into the orbit of all these people.
Yes, and this very much contextualizes the film in 2024 because in the original, Ellen Hutter is pretty much purely a damsel in distress. You know, she is an almost collateral damage towards the end of the film. Okay, she offers herself up as a sacrifice, so she kind of is the hero ultimately, but it's very much, just at the tail end of the film, this comes up. Whereas from the beginning, Lily Rose Depp's character, her version of Ellen, has a lot more sort of agency and power, and like you said, it's her story from the beginning. You know, she's not brought in later on to be this like sacrifice.
Robert Eggers was saying that it was important in this film. It's very much Ellen's story, whereas in previous versions it wasn't. Like you said, and you get that feeling. I mean, the very first scene involves her kind of being summoned by Orlok, and there's like a shadow on her curtains in a lit room. So it starts with her, and it feels that as well. Like a lot of the film is pretty even with how much time it spends with the characters. A lot of the times in these kind of these films, it's with the kind of Thomas Harker, or here it's Thomas Hutter. That a lot of the film is spent with the male characters. Basically, they're the ones saving the day, and then right at the end, Ellen comes in and saves the day.
And I think also I was interested because I couldn't, before I rewatched the 1922 version, I couldn't quite remember if the element, there's a big part of the 2024 version that in order for Count Orlok to suck Ellen's blood, she has to consent to dissolving her marriage essentially and like reasserting her vow to him or something like this. So there's this kind of the storyline of consent and a woman's kind of sexual independence that's quite interesting, like very strong sexual themes in the 2024 version. And I was sure that that was an addition to the story, but actually the consensual element was there in the 1922 version. So I wonder, I have to admit, I haven't read Dracula, but I suspect that was there in the original too. So I was kind of interested to see that that part of the story is there from the beginning, but it's just like brought out further and like made and kind of brought to full fruition in the 2024 version.
Yeah, I think in like especially Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and I mean I read the book years ago, so I can't remember for sure. But they're very sexy, sensual films. Like vampires are sexy apparently. For that all okay.
They are sexy, but I think Ellen Hutter's character being her sexuality and her kind of shame and fear around it, and then kind of almost reclaiming it and then using it, weaponizing it herself in order to save the day. That's like an interesting evolution of that aspect of the vampire story. So I was like very pleased with that. And also I was super pleased with how camp and how much they leaned into the melodrama of the Gothic genre. I found the film thoroughly entertaining, and like I was laughing throughout. Like definitely not scary, but very entertaining. But yeah, I really enjoyed all that bit of it. How did you feel about the film, James? I sensed you had some trepidation about it after seeing it.
Well, I wasn't sure at first. I mean, like I've seen The Northman, and it left me a bit cold. The Northman. I really admired the ambition and the production design, and the visuals. It's immaculate.
This is Robert Eggers' last film.
Robert Eggers' previous film. I never watched The Lighthouse, and I've not seen The Witch either. But I wanted to see this, and I was worried it would be more of the same. And but it's not. It's a beautifully crafted film, like the atmosphere and the tone and the way it's all put together. So yeah, I loved it, and I went to see it at Dolby Cinema. It's shot on film as well. A lot of the film is done. There's a lot that I loved about it, and it won me round after being a bit cool towards it going into The Northman. That actually, I had a great time at the cinema, and I loved watching it. It's shot on film, looks beautiful. The kind of like desaturated color palette, lots of stuff happening in the shadows, like which really plays the strength of film. And yeah, it looked wonderful. Had a great time.
Yeah. I don't think it's like a completely perfect film, but I really enjoyed it, and I think it was exactly what you would want from this kind of a movie, and that's reflected in the box office. It's done really, really well.
Yeah, I'm glad about that. It's because his last film flopped, and the thing is, I went to see The Northman because even though maybe I personally felt a bit cold by it, it's exactly the kind of film I need to be championing. It's like these are the kind of films I complain aren't made enough, which are auteur directors making non-franchise films who are either original scripts. So I mean, Nosferatu, you couldn't really say it's a franchise film, but it's an interesting take on some material.
Yeah, so it was made for 50 million, and so far it's grossed 139 million worldwide. So it's doing very well. It's the highest grossing horror movie of 2024.
Ah, great. That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, because, horror. Oh, by the way, the cinema, that was the thing. Dolby, went to the Dolby Cinema. No one would go to the Dolby Cinema. All the films that are advertised are all very prestige-y, fancy pictures. It was horror, because horror's making money at the box office. And the thing is, horror, you say this so far, this is the biggest box office return for a horror film of 124 million, because it's also quite an expensive horror film, because they're making horror for usually about half the price of Nosferatu. So basically, 2025 is going to have a lot of horror. I think a lot more than last year.
Yeah, I'm happy about that. I thought it.
And the thing is, Lily, right? I don't know about you, because I've got a nervous disposition, so I don't really watch horror as a genre. But all of the trailers for the film, I was chatting to my partner, we went together, and we said they all look really interesting. They look way more interesting than the kind of majority of just mainstream pictures that are around at the moment. But neither of us quite like horror films. So. Just get scared, and then I can't sleep at night, Lily.
I know that I have to say Nosferatu was my kind of horror film, when it's more about the gothic vibes and the kind of almost like the fan service to this to this well-loved story than like really making you jump. And that works for me a lot better. I was happy with that.
And nice to see as well. I was reading about the making of it. Lots of, it was vast majority of it practical. CGI only used. They said actually that they tried to do the big things practically, and then there were certain logistical or health and safety stuff where they were forced to use a green screen, but you'd never think they had to use a green screen because they weren't like fancy set pieces. So and that shows as well. The whole thing feels pretty real. I don't think I'm watching a green screen or I'm watching. They shot most of it in a studio as well, but it's beautifully lit. The cinematography is great. You get that feeling that you really are in these dingy pre-electrical lit houses with candlelight and smoke everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And let us not forget the rats. I read somewhere that Robert Eggers used like 50,000 rats, I want to say.
Yeah.
I may have not got that number quite right, but it was like
sounds like a lot of
a
rats.
Disturbing amount of rats for sure.
But yeah, he was saying how in the shot where they set the crypt on fire, that in the foreground they had real rats and there was perspex to stop them. They were in perspex boxes so that you couldn't see the box, but you could see the rats and they wouldn't go everywhere. But then in the distance, then they used CGI rats because obviously they're further back in the frame. So the hero rats are the real deal. Just all the stuff that you're meant to do when you make a good film that feels like, why is this special? This is how you do it.
Yes. Actually, that's reminded me, when I read of this rat stat, I believe it described it as 50,000 rat actors were cast for the film. I really love the idea of being like an
I'm really
agent
sorry you
for
haven't
rat
made
actors.
the part, but we will keep you in mind for any other rat parts we have in our future work.
God, you'd be devastated, wouldn't you, if you were passed over yet again?
It's not you, love. It's just you haven't found the right role yet.
So we need to talk about Robert Eggers a bit more because Nosferatu is sort of his. There is definitely a metaphor that I can use, but I don't know what it is. But it's the movie he was always destined to make, it seems.
Yeah, I think every director has like the film that is the one the film for them, So going back to Nolan, who I managed not to reference too often, but for him it was Inception. That was a film that he'd had bubbling in his head since he was 15 years old, and it's absolutely same with Robert Eggers.
White Whale, that was what I was thinking of. It's his White Whale.
But the thing about his White Whale, I was thinking the Moby Dick thing because what we think is that what the reference is, the White Whale is, but isn't that like that he can never capture him?
Oh,
he can never capture. Whereas this, this isn't that, is it?
James, that's good to know. I'm so glad this isn't being recorded.
I haven't read the book, so somebody please tell me if that is what it means. Anyway,
we're touching on a lot of classics that we need to read
that we haven't read. Yeah. But yeah, this is similar for Eggers. This is the film that he's had bubbling away since he was a kid. In fact, it's connected to his entire journey as a filmmaker because actually he staged like an amateur dramatic version of Nosferatu. I think a school play version when he was younger, and he directed it, did the costume, did the production design, kind of pulled it all together, and it got such a word of mouth and reputation that I think somebody saw it and then they asked them to stage this version of it professionally. So that kind of got his break, like at first in theatre, but then I guess that kind of rolled into film.
Yeah. That was what kind of inspired him to go into filmmaking. And then for a long time he was a production designer before he made The Witch, which I have seen, and it is good. I feel like it loses its way in the end. I was a little bit unsatisfied with the ending, but I feel like that is a classic issue with horror films. It's kind of hard to, like, once you set up these creepy and amazing kind of set piece, it's kind of be hard to follow through. So I'm glad that I feel like this movie he kind of finally lands the plane. He's gotten to his stride. But yeah, I read that after The Witch, it was like seemed then to be that would be his next film, Nosferatu. He was gathering funding to make it at that stage, which he described it as feeling ugly and blasphemous and egomaniacal as a filmmaker to do that. This is such a iconic movie in film history, and I mean he's not. He's not wrong, and to be honest, I think it's good that he made The Northman, he made The Lighthouse in between, because those films, I don't think either of them are totally perfect. They're like definitely on the right track and doing interesting things and a bit different. And I feel like with this one, he probably learned a lot of lessons.
I think he said that in an interview I read, is that he's very glad it didn't work out as it did because he's just got better. They both him and his cinematographer learnt lessons on those previous two, and I think it definitely shows in Nosferatu. I mean, I have only seen The Northman, but this is certainly an improvement over that in every respect.
Yeah, and the other thing I will say is that because he began working on it a few years ago, there was a very different cast attached at that point. It was going to be Anya Taylor-Joy in the part of Ellen and Harry Styles playing her husband.
What? Oh my God! Was this around the same period when he was getting? Well, he got cast in Dunkirk.
Yeah, I think it was after that.
What was the one we saw for the Don't Worry, Darling?
Oh yes, I forgot about that.
He had that He had a bit of a few year run.
I think I don't have any complaints with him as an actor, I have to say, but in particular, I feel like Anya Taylor-Joy, I can completely see her in this role. She would have done a great job. But I really loved seeing Lily Rose Depp in the part because I think that she is often dismissed as a Nepo baby and she hasn't yet had that kind of truly breakout role. You know, there have been a lot of false starts with, you know, The Idol and whatever else.
What was it called? Hoser yogas? Something yoga hosers?
Oh, I don't know what that is. What is that?
Oh, I think that's her debut. It's just check out the trailer. That's all I will say. Look, just what the fuck.
Okay. We will add a link to the show notes to that as well, and I will be looking at it after we've finished recording. Well, I think she is fantastic in this film. She really she carries the film. I mean, there are
she's great.
Fantastic performances all around her, but she really helms it. Her British accent is pitch perfect, and she just really does a great job at being melodramatic in keeping with the tone of the film, but also actually bringing real heart to it. And I thought she was fantastic. So I'm excited to see her in other things because she is obviously also beautiful. So it's always a joy to see her on screen.
Yeah, very beautiful. And I had dismissed her a bit of a Nepo baby, especially because I hadn't seen her in The Idol, but I've seen the trailer for Yoga Hosers, and I was like, Jesus, Nepo baby.
She was very good in The Idol. There are some things that are good in The Idol. I thought that
really,
the very first episode has got some good scenes with with her people, with her agent and whoever else. But anything with The Weeknd is just absolutely horrific. So that's just a side take.
Wow, you actually watched it though, Lily. You're one of the few.
I know. Well, I was just so intrigued because of the whole crazy story around the film.
I was intrigued, but not quite enough to cross the threshold of watching it. But I was intrigued.
I skipped through most of the sex scenes because they were just too excruciating and genuinely disturbing, and not in a way that felt useful to put myself through. But my takeaway from it was Lily Rose Depp is a great actor and a great singer and dancer, and I look forward to seeing her in something good.
Yeah, and the other thing because there's a possession sequence halfway through the film in Nosferatu, which is almost like a textbook, really well executed. Like you've seen this kind of thing before. Like, you know, there's a woman in a bed, and then suddenly she's levitated off the floor, and her back's arched. But it's beautifully done. And I was reading about the making of it. They're saying that people think that it was being CGI where they've twisted limbs, but they said no, that's Lily Rose Depp's physicality. She's got an excellent kind of physicality with her body, and that they didn't really do any, you know, she's kind of arching herself in those positions. I mean, they've got supports for her and all sorts of stuff, but I don't think they did anything to kind of digitally distort her body. I don't think.
Wow, that's amazing. That's very impressive. Yeah, and again, that again takes me back to the the sort of sexual element of the film, if you will.
Ooh la la. Why, Lily, I didn't think it was that kind of podcast.
Well, I just was so struck and taken with that part of the film, which we have already gone into a little bit, but I just want to say that I think that it's interesting. We're going to be talking about Baby Girl next week, and that movie is very much an evolution of the 1990s erotic thriller. And I think it's interesting that this film is coming out now. Okay, it's around 100 years after the original Nosferatu came out, so it's not surprising that there's a remake. But I think it's interesting that another genre that was very big in the 90s, aka the gothic horror, is back with this adaptation, and there is almost like there's like a bridging of the, like, Baby Girl and Nosferatu do have this common this common subject matter of, a lot of it is about like a woman's sexuality and her shame around her sexuality, and her finding the strength to put her shame aside and kind of own it, if you will, with different outcomes, of course, between Baby Girl and Nosferatu. But I think that there's definitely that. So I'll be interested to see if we get any more gothic adaptations, like in the years to come, in the next couple of years, because I just find it's an interesting part of the 90s film genre. You know, you had Interview with a Vampire, Sleepy Hollow, Bram Stoker's Dracula, even.
Which I love.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Absolutely love that film.
Really?
And you know, I was watching just because it's like so bombastic,
it's crazy.
and ludicrous.
It's too much.
I love it.
It's too much for me.
Oh, I know, it's like a rich stew. It's like a rich stew. The film that I've not watched, but I was struck watching this remake, was like, oh God, of course, Willem Dafoe was the lead actor in Shadow of the Vampire, which I need to watch now. Which is all about, it's a fictionalized version of the making of the 1922 film, with the premise being that the actor Max Schreck, who plays Count Orlok, is actually really an actual vampire. That's the whole premise of the film. So, and to kind of disguise the fact that he's killing people, they make it into a film, so it's as if he's acting. But he keeps knocking off the cast and crew as they're going through. I think that's the gist of it. And so I bet Willem Dafoe was cracking out the anecdotes from 20 years prior when he was on Nosferatu set.
Yeah, that's so pleasing that he was brought back for this one. And he's another excellent performance from Willem Dafoe. Like, you know you're in safe hands when he's in a film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Willem Dafoe, I'm getting the feeling he's like the Michael Caine for Christopher Nolan. This is Robert Eggers, as like, you know, get him in, because, you know, he always brightens up a scene when he's in it. He's so good with other actors as well, even though he's very kind of like, you know, he's got this over the top quality. He never, I don't know, I think he's really good with other actors. I think he gives them something to bounce off.
Yeah, you're right. He doesn't steal the show, even though he could easily.
Yeah, it's like that's like that's a very good balancing act. You know, he gives enough character and eccentricity, but he doesn't drag the whole film towards him. Like I absolutely loved that kind of quite small scene with him and Ellen, where he was saying that they're kind of discussing that she needs to sort this, that she's going to have to sacrifice herself. You know, and he's saying that you would have been a high priestess in the life, and it's a really nice kind of smaller scene. You know.
Yeah. So I think overall, those are two films that you should see: the original and the remake.
And you know, and if you fancy treating yourself, I would strongly recommend hunting it down at a Dolby Cinema. It's like like Robert Eggers has gone on record, him and his cinematographer, saying it is our preferred way for the movie to be seen. So, you know, I went to see it exactly as the director wanted me to, and I have to say it was very luxurious experience.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we didn't really talk about it that much, but it is a beautiful looking film. Like, you can see where the money went. It's a very rich. It really does satiate that if you're into the gothic type of film, it really does, like,
it hits the spot.
Yeah.
And it's nice as well, budget conscious filmmakers, it looks way more expensive than $50 million. It looks like a lot more money has been spent, which
That's
means
true,
that they really are filmmakers who are trying to craft something with whatever they've been given.
Yeah, that's true. Even as I said, I was thinking, actually, it looks more like it costs more than 50 mil. It looks
especially when you read all these
expensive.
when you're reading about all these bloody Marvel films that keep getting reshot and the budgets are $400 million and they look like cheap crap.
And the Robbie Williams movie that's just come out, like, what on earth? Let me look it up, what that's cost.
I'm going with 100 million. 100 million on the 110, I'm going to go with.
How did you know? Oh, my God.
Just vibes. I just like, you know, it's one of my favourite things. I'm like, what's the budget? What should it have been? What do I think it is? Yeah.
Yeah. So the Robbie Williams movie Better Man was 110 mil, so more than double the budget of of Nosferatu. And hey, look, I haven't seen it, so I really couldn't comment. But I suspect it doesn't look as expensive as Nosferatu does.
Well, yeah, or let us know if we're wrong. And on
All
that
right,
rather tangential note,
I know, God. We seem to always go off on a tangent towards the end and get off from the original subject.
how did we get to fucking Robbie Williams? I will never know. Anyway.
Well, on that note, thank you all for listening to another episode of Groovy Movies.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you could leave us a like or a nice review, it all helps get this podcast out and about into the world.
So we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Groovy Movies is produced and edited by us, Lily Austin and James Brailsford. And James also produced the theme music.
Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Groovy Movies Pod, or email us groovymoviespod@gmail.com.
For more information about the films discussed, check out the show notes.